In June 1944, the peaceful waters of the Pacific became a battleground for one of the greatest carrier confrontations in naval history, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In a clash that would determine dominance of the Pacific, Japan's once dominant naval air power challenged the growing strength of the U.S. Navy. This battle was about more than ships and planes. It was about survival, strategy, and the changing tide of war. What happened during those pivotal days will cripple Japan's naval ambitions and change the path of World War II. What really was the Battle of the Philippine Sea? The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which took place on June 19th to the 20th, 1944, was an intense battle between the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet and the United States Navy's Pacific Fleet in the waters west of the Mariana Islands. It was a watershed moment, precipitated by Japan's immediate response to the American assault of Saipan. To block the U.S. advance, Admiral Toyota chose to confront their strong carrier forces rather than the fragile American troop transports. He saw this as the long-awaited decisive battle that may swing the war in Japan's favor by damaging U.S. naval supremacy. This risk, however, proved to be disastrous for Japan. The conflict dealt a catastrophic blow to their already deteriorating naval air arm, stripping them of their most experienced pilots and left their air force devastated beyond repair. Japan's combined fleet, once a formidable force, was rendered incapable of carrying out serious offensive actions in the future. According to historian Samuel Eliot Morrison, this was the war's most significant carrier battle. The forces involved were 3 to 4 times those in previous battles, such as Midway, and victory was so complete that the Japanese could never again participate on such a scale. Despite Japan's first tactical onslaught, the outcome sealed their fate and signaled the end of their naval superiority in the Pacific. It was the final of 5 significant carrier versus carrier confrontations between American and Japanese naval forces, taking place against the backdrop of the United States amphibious invasion of the Marianas Islands. This fight pitted the United States Navy's Fifth Fleet against the Imperial Japanese Navy's Mobile Fleet and neighboring island garrisons, resulting in the greatest carrier engagement in history, with 24 aircraft carriers deploying around 1,350 carrier-based aircraft. The air portion of the conflict immediately became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a moniker given by American aviators in reference to the astounding loss ratio inflicted on Japanese aircraft by U.S. pilots and anti-aircraft guns. During a debriefing, a pilot from the USS Lexington reportedly stated, "Why, hell, it was just like an old-time turkey shoot down home." The lopsided victory was due to American pilots' greater training, improved tactics, and technological advantages such as new anti-aircraft ship defenses, especially the cutting-edge proximity fuse. In contrast, Japanese pilots, many of whom were recent replacements with little training or combat experience, were unprepared to face such a skilled and well-equipped adversary. Furthermore, Allied forces got access to important Japanese defense plans recovered from the wreckage of a plane carrying Admiral Minichi Koga, the former commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet, in March 1944. American submarines played an important part in the conflict, torpedoing and sinking 2 of Japan's main fleet carriers. The U.S. carriers responded with a major aircraft assault, sinking 1 light carrier and damaging 3 others. However, as darkness fell, many American aircraft were forced to return with little fuel, resulting in the loss of 80 planes. Despite early disappointment at what was perceived as a squandered opportunity to completely destroy the Japanese fleet, the engagement dealt a crushing blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy. It had lost most of its carrier air power and would never recover. This encounter, together with the Battle of the Leyte Gulf 4 months later, signaled the end of Japanese aircraft carrier operations. The remaining Japanese carriers were mostly restricted to ports, unable to contribute significantly to the rest of the war. So, why did the Japanese plan for a decisive battle with a force with little to nearly no training in combat experience? From the start of the Pacific War in December 1941, Japan's strategic vision was focused on one overarching goal: to inflict such severe casualties on the U.S. military that the American public and government would be compelled to reassess their commitment to the conflict. Japan aimed to create an uncomfortable scenario in which the United States would sue for peace, allowing Japan to keep control of its seized Asian territory. This concept of a decisive battle permeated Japanese military thinking and served as the foundation of their Pacific conflict strategy. Originally, the strategy was a calculated gamble. Japanese authorities believed that by eliminating a substantial component of the U.S. Navy, particularly its aircraft carriers, they could weaken the Americans' resolve to fight. They miscalculated the United States' industrial prowess and its ability to replace damaged ships and aircraft. Still, Japan hoped that a decisive win in a single huge fight would turn the balance of the war in their favor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor strike, grew increasingly suspicious of the approach as the war unfolded. While he had engineered the initial blow that drew the United States into the war, Yamamoto acknowledged Japan's limitations in maintaining long-term struggle with the U.S. He was wary of putting too much reliance on the concept of one decisive engagement as the war progressed and Japan's resources diminished. Yamamoto's influence on strategy, however, came to a stop abruptly on April 18, 1943, when he was slain in Operation Vengeance, a deliberate assassination by U.S. forces who had intercepted Japanese communications and heard of his travel plans. Admiral Minichi Koga assumed command of Japan's combined fleet following Yamamoto's death. Koga, like his predecessors, believed in the idea of a decisive naval war. His intention was to confront the U.S. fleet in such a clash by early 1944. Koga's concept was largely a continuation of Yamamoto's original strategy, but more urgent, as the United States made considerable inroads throughout the Pacific. Japan's military leadership remained focused on delivering a single huge strike that would halt the American advance and secure Japan's sovereignty over its empire. Admiral Koga and his staff began developing the so-called Z Plan, which defined Japan's strategy for the upcoming critical naval battle of 1944. However, Koga's time as commander-in-chief was tragically short. On March 31, 1944, his aircraft, a Kawanishi H-8K flying boat, crashed with a strong storm, killing Koga and several senior officials. The loss of Koga was a devastating blow to the Japanese Navy, but it was made worse by another key incident that occurred shortly afterward. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudomi, Koga's chief of staff, had been flying in another plane that crashed during the same storm. Fukudomi survived, but the Z Plan documents, which included Japan's tightly guarded military strategy, did not sync with the wreckage. Instead, critical documents were seized by Filipino insurgents operating in the area. These intrepid soldiers, cognizant of the importance of their discovery, transported the Z Plan files through a perilous network of resistance to General Douglas MacArthur's Military Intelligence Service, MIS, in Brisbane, Australia. When the documents reached the MIS, they were swiftly translated and transmitted to Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the United States Pacific Fleet. With the Z Plan in hand, Nimitz and his staff gained important insight into Japan's intentions and tactics for the impending naval clash. The plan was then sent to U.S. fleet commanders, allowing them to anticipate Japan's movements during the key battle of the Philippine Sea. Following Koga's death, Admiral Somu Toyoda was named the new commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. Toyoda, like his predecessors, was devoted to the concept of a decisive struggle and swiftly began preparing Japan's operational plans. He virtually completely embraced Koga's Z Plan, with just minor changes, and calling it Operation Eigo. Operation Eigo envisioned a massive naval battle in which the Japanese would lure the U.S. force into a trap. They expected to overwhelm the American fleet by combining their surviving carrier forces with land-based aircraft from adjacent islands. Despite being outnumbered in ships and aircraft, the Japanese believed that their combined forces, including the addition of land-based planes, could make up the difference and give them the necessary advantage to victory. In early June 1944, Japan spotted U.S. forces marching on Saipan in the Marianas Islands, paving the way for the long-anticipated combat. This, they believed, was their opportunity to ultimately halt the American advance and shift the balance of power in the Pacific. While Japan prepared for the upcoming engagement, they were unaware that their meticulously designed preparations had already been jeopardized. The United States Navy, armed with information from the seized Z Plan, was well prepared for Japan's operations. American commanders understood when and where the Japanese would strike, so they could modify their forces accordingly. This intelligence advantage played an important role in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese, feeling they possessed the element of surprise, rushed forward with confidence, only to discover that the Americans were not only prepared, but strategically superior in practically every way. Despite Japan's hopes that land-based aircraft would supplement its carriers, the land-based squadrons were mainly unsuccessful due to inadequate training, a lack of coordination, and outmoded equipment. Meanwhile, the U.S. forces were headed by highly experienced commanders and aviators who had access to new technologies and a significantly more robust logistical support network. Japan approached the Battle of the Philippine Sea with significant disadvantages that they were unable to overcome. Their aircraft carriers were outmatched by the larger and more numerous American carriers, while Japan's carrier fleet had been severely weakened by earlier conflicts, particularly the Battle of Midway. The United States had continued to develop new carriers at a rate that Japan could not match. Furthermore, Japan's once elite fleet of naval aviators had been nearly depleted. The pilots deployed into battle were frequently new out of training, with few flight hours and almost no combat experience. This contrasted sharply with the well-trained and combat-hardened U.S. pilots, who profited from superior tactics, coordination, and cutting-edge technology, such as radar and modern anti-aircraft defensive systems. The confluence of these factors, American awareness of Japan's plans, superior technology, better trained pilots, and a stronger logistical base, made Operation AGO doomed from the beginning. Despite Japan's aspirations for a decisive victory, the Battle of the Philippine Sea turned out to be one of the war's most lopsided encounters, a calamity from which Japan's fleet would never recover. By the time the war began, Japan was fighting with its back to the wall, and the consequences would be disastrous. This so-called decisive battle would clinch Japan's destiny in the Pacific, with the Imperial Japanese Navy losing nearly all of its remaining carrier air strength. These strategic deficiencies in Japan's plans, along with America's superior might and planning, assured that the Battle of the Philippine Sea would be remembered as one of Japan's most catastrophic defeats, rather than its greatest success. Meanwhile, the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, ability to deploy naval air forces had been severely hampered by previous conflicts, significant losses of experienced aircrew during important engagements in the Coral Sea, Midway, and throughout the Solomon Islands campaign from 1942 to 1943, severely reduced Japan's carrier forces. These defeats destroyed the IJN's elite pool of skilled carrier pilots, resulting in the demise of their air groups. Following the Solomon Islands War, the Japanese struggled to fill their air crews. It took over a year to rebuild the carrier air groups after these costly losses, and the new pilots were significantly less experienced than their predecessors. This put Japan at a significant disadvantage when it fought the United States in subsequent battles, particularly the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In addition to these manpower issues, Japan's logistics condition deteriorated quickly by early 1944. One of the most pressing challenges they encountered was a lack of oil and fuel. Japan had previously relied significantly on petroleum supplies from the Dutch East Indies, but by mid-1944, the country lacked the necessary number of oil tankers to deliver the massive amounts of petroleum required to keep its war machine running. This fuel scarcity had a significant influence on Japan's fleet, particularly its carrier group's ability to operate successfully. In a desperate attempt, Japanese carriers began refueling with unrefined petroleum from Tarakan, one of the most important oil-producing districts in the Dutch East Indies. This crude oil, however, was not properly desalted or refined, resulting in a series of mechanical issues. The unrefined petroleum contained hazardous compounds that damaged Japanese ships' boiler tubes, drastically limiting operational capability. Furthermore, the unremoved naphtha portion in the fuel created volatile atmospheres within the carriers, making it difficult to adopt appropriate damage control measures. This fuel shortage created a ticking time bomb for the Imperial Japanese Navy's fleet, making their carriers even more vulnerable in combat. As the situation deteriorated, the United States Navy resumed its relentless push throughout the Central Pacific, island after island. By early 1944, the United States had evolved a clear strategy for isolating Japanese strongholds, using amphibious assaults and air supremacy. The United States fleet moved carefully, taking vital islands that served as forward bases for ongoing operations against Japan. Each island taken drove U.S. forces closer to Japan's home islands, putting additional pressure on Japanese leaders to deliver a decisive blow. While U.S. leaders, especially Admiral Raymond Spruance, were aware that the Japanese could try to strike against U.S. transports and recently landed forces, their primary concern was the possibility of an all-out carrier engagement. By this stage, American troops had established an understanding of the Japanese strategic thinking, realizing that Japan was looking for a climactic conflict in which they might deploy their remaining carrier forces in a last-ditch effort to reverse the tide of the war. Unbeknownst to the Americans, Japan's true goal in mid-1944 was not to target U.S. shipments, but to meet and defeat the fast carrier task force in what they anticipated would be the decisive fight of the Pacific War. On June 12, 1944, U.S. carrier forces conducted a series of airstrikes on the Marianas, leading Admiral Somu Toyoda to believe that an American invasion was near. The Japanese were taken aback by the United States offensive maneuver, as they expected the next American target to be farther south, in the Caroline Islands or the Palau. As a result, the Marianas were relatively minimally protected, with only 50 land-based aircraft. However, the U.S. carriers maintained their operations over the next few days, with more air raids taking place on June 13th to 15th. During this time, the U.S. surface forces bombed the Marianas, and on June 15th, troops began landing on Saipan. The Marianas' significance cannot be emphasized. With possession of these islands, American strategic bombers would be within striking distance of Japan's home islands, making the Marianas an important point of defense for the Imperial Japanese Navy, or IJN. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Japan chose to proceed with the long-anticipated Kantai Kessen, meaning decisive combat, a style that had been central to Japan's naval strategy during the war. Admiral Toyoda, certain that the critical moment had arrived, authorized a huge counterattack that involved practically every available ship in the Japanese fleet. The Japanese fleet convened on June 16th in the western Philippine Sea, where it finished refueling the next day. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the fleet from his freshly commissioned flagship, Taiho. Taiho was armed with strengthened torpedo blisters, command facilities, and a strong air group. Most significantly, it was the first Japanese carrier to have an armor-plated flight deck, which was intended to withstand bomb strikes with minimal damage. Ozawa's fleet was a strong collection of carriers, battleships, and cruisers, ready to strike what Japan anticipated would be a devastating blow to the approaching U.S. troops. On the night of June 15th, at 1835, the American submarine USS Flying Fish spotted a Japanese carrier and battleship force emerging from San Bernardino Strait. Shortly after, another U.S. submarine, USS Seahorse, discovered a Japanese battleship and cruiser force about 200 miles east of Mindanao. Under orders to report sightings before launching attacks, Flying Fish surfaced after dark and radioed its findings. These reports reached Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the United States Fifth Fleet, who became convinced that a significant Japanese operation was underway. After speaking with Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pacific Fleet headquarters in Hawaii, Spruance directed Rear Admiral Mark Mitzer, commander of Task Force 58, the Fast Carrier Task Force, to regroup and transfer his forces west of Saipan into the Philippine Sea. The remaining surface forces of Task Force 52 were directed to remain near Saipan, providing security for the invasion fleet and air support for the ongoing landings. In the late hours of June 18th, Admiral Nimitz notified Spruance that a Japanese vessel had broken radio silence. The intercepted signal appeared to be a message from Admiral Ozawa to his land-based air forces on Guam. The signal's origin was estimated to be around 355 miles west-southwest of Task Force 58, using direction-finding technologies. Although Mitzer and his staff briefly contemplated the prospect of a Japanese ruse, as the Japanese frequently deployed decoys to fool their foes, Mitzer realized the probability of a direct confrontation with Ozawa's fleet during the night. Arleigh Burke, Mitzer's chief of staff and a former destroyer squadron leader who had participated in many night fights in the Solomon Islands, predicted that Admiral Willis Lee, commander of the battle line, would prefer a night confrontation. However, Lee, who had been involved in a chaotic night combat off Guadalcanal, was less enthusiastic. He strongly opposed the plan because he felt his crews were not appropriately trained for night surface warfare. Mitzer subsequently requested Spruance for permission to maneuver Task Force 58 westward during the night so that his carriers might launch an air assault on the Japanese fleet at daybreak. Spruance declined the proposal after giving it an hour of consideration. Mitzer's staff was dismayed by this choice, believing it would leave them open to a major Japanese strike the next morning. Burke subsequently said, "We knew we'd have hell slugged out of us in the morning. We knew we couldn't contact them. We knew they could contact us." Nimitz's orders impacted Spruance's caution as they placed the safety of the invasion fleet over the pursuit of the Japanese Navy. Concerned that the Japanese may use diversionary tactics to drive the U.S. fleet away from the Marianas, leaving the invasion troops vulnerable to a counterattack, Spruance made the deliberate choice to retain the main U.S. strike force near to Saipan. Destroying the Japanese fleet was a secondary goal. Spruance's primary job was to protect the ongoing invasion. His caution was justified, as Japanese naval plans sometimes used decoys to divert enemy forces away from important targets, and such a technique was likely in play. Before dawn on June 19th, Spruance requested that, in the absence of any substantial targets, U.S. bombers be sent to crater the airfields on Rota and Guam. However, Task Force 58 had already spent the majority of its contact fuse bombs in earlier raids, leaving Mitzer with only armor-piercing bombs capable of hitting German ships. He informed Spruance that additional airport attacks were not viable. When daylight broke, Task Force 58 launched search aircraft, combat air patrols or CAP, and anti-submarine patrols. The fleet then moved westward to obtain more maneuvering space away from the islands. By this stage, the United States Navy had built a sophisticated air control system that enabled radar-guided CAP fighters to intercept inbound enemy bombers long before they reached the fleet. Any Japanese planes that made it past the CAP would be met with a lethal torrent of anti-aircraft fire from the fleet's screening battleships and cruisers, which were outfitted with the most advanced proximity-fused rounds. This multi-layered defense, which included CAP fighters, long-range radar, and concentrated anti-aircraft fire, was the zenith of American naval air defense technology throughout the war. While Admiral Ozawa's Japanese fleet was formidable, it would soon be defeated by a U.S. Navy that was more prepared, technologically superior, and acting from a strategic advantage. June 19, 1944. Japanese search patrols had already taken to the skies before sunrise, using some of the 50 aircraft stationed on Guam. A Mitsubishi A6M0 was among them, and by 5:50, it had spotted Task Force 58, or TF-58, a group of U.S. Navy vessels. The pilot reported his sighting before attempting to attack the picket destroyer USS Stockham, but was shot down by the USS Yarnall. When Japanese forces learned of the U.S. fleet's presence, they began launching planes from Guam. However, TF-58's radar rapidly detected their movement. prompting a squadron of 30 Grumman F-6F Hellcats from the USS Belleau Wood to intercept, arriving while the Japanese aircraft were still launching from Orote Field. The Hellcats struck quickly, downing 35 enemy planes while losing only one Hellcat. Throughout the day, the US soldiers would repeat this process as they prepared for fresh waves of Japanese strikes. At 9:57, TF-58's radar identified the first substantial Japanese raid, with contacts approaching from 150 miles west. Admiral Mark Mitcher, the task force commander, promptly ordered fighters back from Guam and deployed layers of combat air patrol, also called CAP, to intercept the attackers. The Japanese aircraft, numbered 68, had approached within 70 miles when they were greeted by waves of US Hellcats, which shot down 25 planes in the initial confrontation. Additional fighters joined in, destroying 16 additional Japanese planes. Some of the surviving assailants made their way to the fleet, but their attacks on the picket destroyers USS Yarnall and Stockholm were ineffective. The only Japanese victory occurred when a bomber broke through to strike the USS South Dakota, killing or injuring more than 50 sailors, but failing to damage the ship. At 11:07, a second wave of 107 Japanese aircraft was observed. Intercepted 60 miles out, US Hellcats devastated the invading force, destroying 70 planes before they could approach the fleet. Only 6 aircraft were able to get close enough to attack Admiral Alfred E. Montgomery's group, but they caused little damage before being shot down. Only 10 planes from the entire wave returned to base. Later, around 1300 hours, a further Japanese raid of 47 aircraft approached from the north and met the same fate. 7 planes were shot down after being intercepted 50 miles away, while many others failed to press their attacks. The remaining 40 aircraft managed to flee, but their attacks were ineffectual. The final Japanese attack wave, which launched between 11 and 11:30, was foiled by navigational problems after being given the incorrect coordinates for TF-58's location. The planes separated into 2 groups and headed for Guam and Rota to refuel. One group came upon Montgomery's task force and lost half of its members in an aerial fight. A smaller number of dive bombers attacked the carriers USS Wasp and USS Bunker Hill, but scored no hits before being shot down. Those who made it to Guam were met by US Hellcats, which destroyed 30 of the 49 aircraft while landing at Orote Field. By the conclusion of the day, Japan had lost over 350 planes, while the United States had lost only 30 and suffered no substantial damage to its fleet. Meanwhile, American submarines provided key intelligence and delivered decisive strikes to Japan's navy. At 8:16, the USS Albacore spotted the Japanese carrier Taiho, Ozawa's flagship. Despite technical issues with its fire control system, the Albacore fired a spread of 6 torpedoes, one of which struck Taiho, causing damage and catastrophic gasoline vapor explosions later that day. Similarly, USS Kavala hit the carrier Shokaku with 3 torpedoes. The explosions devastated Shokaku, and the ship sank due to a huge detonation of its aviation fuel, taking 1,263 men with it. On the following day, June 20th, 1944, TF-58 resumed its onslaught, though the Japanese fleet remained elusive. A garbled report from an Enterprise search plane at 15:12 supplied Mitcher with the breakthrough he needed. The Japanese fleet, 275 miles away, was within American strike range, but as daylight faded, Mitcher decided to launch an all-out attack. The 226 U.S. aircraft launched, including Hellcats, Avengers, and dive bombers, flew over the Japanese Navy shortly before dusk. The overwhelming number of U.S. planes overwhelmed Japan's defenses. The carrier Hio was attacked by explosives and torpedoes, causing a fuel explosion that sank her. Other Japanese carriers, notably Zuikaku, Junyo, and Chiyoda, sustained damage but remained afloat. The battleship Haruna received damage but continued to operate. In total, 20 U.S. planes were lost in the attack. As darkness fell, TF-58 encountered a new challenge. collecting the returning planes in the dark. Mitzer made the audacious decision to instruct his ships to illuminate themselves, a dangerous maneuver considering the threat of Japanese submarines and planes. Despite this, 80 planes were lost when they attempted to land in the dark, with many crews ditching into the sea. Rescue operations lasted all night, saving the majority of the fallen pilots and crew members. The Battle of the Philippine Sea resulted in a decisive victory for the U.S. Navy, crippling Japan's carrier force and ensuring Allied control of the Pacific. The quantity of Japanese aircraft losses earned the conflict the nickname the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and it marked a watershed moment in the Pacific War. That night, as the fight drew to a close, Admiral Toyota made an important choice. He ordered Admiral Ozawa to leave the Philippine Sea. The U.S. forces, while ready for pursuit, were no longer in active combat. The conflict had ended. The Japanese launched 4 big strikes with 373 carrier aircraft. The Taiho and Shokaku were sunk, resulting in the loss of 243 lives and the return of only 130 survivors to their carriers. The aftermath was catastrophic. In just 2 days, Japan lost 3 aircraft carriers, more than 350 carrier aircraft, and over 200 land-based jets. In comparison, U.S. losses were far lower. 23 aircraft were lost on the first day, and while the second day saw more losses, the total was still significantly lower. Of the 226 American planes launched in the final strike, 115 returned. The majority of those lost were due to fuel shortages, which forced pilots to ditch into the sea or crash while attempting to land at night. This fight marked a watershed moment in naval history. Japan had lost 9 carriers in the 5 main carrier-on-carrier confrontations that had occurred between the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of the Philippine Sea, while the United States had lost just 4. More catastrophic than the loss of ships was Japan's inability to replace the veteran pilots and competent airmen who were lost. Following the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, the Japanese Navy spent nearly a year reconstructing its destroyed carrier air groups. Now, 90% of the carrier-based pilots had left, leaving barely enough to establish an air group for 1 light carrier. As the conflict progressed, the Japanese would suffer with these crucial casualties. By the Battle of Leyte Gulf 4 months later, Japan had sent out a decoy carrier group of 6 carriers, 2 of which were hybrids, but they could only muster 108 aircraft. These carriers would be used as bait to divert the U.S. Navy away from Leyte and its landing forces. Meanwhile, the Japanese populace remained unaware of the scale of the setback. Although the Battle of the Philippine Sea was acknowledged, the extent of the tragedy was kept hidden. On the American side, the conflict had a different tone. While U.S. forces suffered considerable casualties, particularly on the second day, the damage was minor in comparison to Japan's severe assaults. Admiral Spruance, known for his cautious attitude, was chastised for not using his superior forces more aggressively against the retreating Japanese. Many thought he squandered an opportunity to fully destroy the remaining Japanese carriers. His decision to emphasize protecting the Mariana Islands invasion over a decisive chase irritated many, particularly aviators. Admiral John Towers, a naval aviation pioneer, went so far as to propose Spruance's removal, which Admiral Nimitz declined. Spruance's restraint could be compared with Admiral Halsey's constant pursuit at the Battle of Leyte Gulf months later, which nearly ended in disaster. Halsey's concentration on an enemy decoy force exposed American landing forces, who were only saved by the desperate operations of a few tiny American ships. Spruance, on the other hand, avoided exposing his carriers to similar dangers, preserving his forces for future engagements. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, U.S. submarines sank 2 of Japan's 3 fleet carriers, including Taiho and Shokaku, but did not completely destroy the fleet. Only Zuikaku continued to operate. The U.S. F-6F Hellcat fighters proved to be more powerful, faster, and armored than the elderly Japanese A-6M-0. The Zero, once groundbreaking, was now outmatched. Japan's newer D-4Y Judy dive bomber was quick but frail, easily destroyed by American weaponry. Japanese airmen, who were poorly trained and rushed into action, were unable to compete with seasoned and well-trained American pilots. During this engagement, fewer than 24 American Hellcats were lost in air-to-air combat, but approximately 480 Japanese aircraft were shot down, the majority of which were carrier-based. It was a lopsided affair. Beyond its immediate naval ramifications, the fight had far-reaching implications. General MacArthur's invasion of Biak in Dutch New Guinea benefited tremendously from Japan's emphasis on the Philippine Sea. The battleships Yamato and Musashi were supposed to face MacArthur's forces, but they were moved north to screen Japan's carriers for Operation Ago. As a result, Japan's most powerful ships played a minor role in the conflict, primarily performing anti-aircraft tasks. Without enough aircraft or skilled pilots, Japan's carriers became decoys rather than offensive threats. The war would continue, but Japan's ability to retaliate against the United States in any meaningful sense had been harmed. For the United States, the battle was a critical stride forward in its Pacific campaign, setting the way for future wins such as the liberation of the Philippines and, eventually, Japan's capitulation. It is fair to say that the Battle of the Philippine Sea was more than simply another confrontation between warships and aircraft in the Pacific theater. It was a watershed moment in the struggle for domination over the Pacific Ocean. By 1944, the tide of war had turned in favor of the Allies, but the Japanese Empire clung stubbornly to its last territory. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would determine more than simply the fates of the fleets involved. It would herald the end of Japan's ability to defend its vast island empire, and eventually its chances of extending the war. For the United States, capturing the Philippine Sea and its neighboring islands was a step towards victory. To understand why this battle was so important, one must consider the overall Pacific strategy and the consequences of a U.S. win. At its core, the fight marked the culmination of two opposing strategic goals: the United States' advance towards Japan's home islands and Japan's increasingly desperate defense of its captured territory. The year was 1944, and the United States was undertaking a difficult struggle to drive the Japanese from their captured territory. Japan's empire spanned huge parts of the Pacific, but the key to its dominance was a series of islands strategically placed to control maritime lanes and provide air bases. Among these, the Marianas Islands, located between Japan and U.S.-controlled bases in the Central Pacific, were vital. For Japan, the Marianas were an important line of defense, safeguarding both the Philippines and, indirectly, the Japanese mainland. For the United States, they were the entryway to Japan's economic heartland. To truly appreciate the stakes, one must first understand the geography and geopolitical significance of the Marianas. These islands, including Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, were well positioned to serve as forward operating bases for the United States. American B-29 bombers could launch attacks on Japan from these islands, bringing the battle to the home islands in ways that were previously unthinkable. The Marianas were also important in controlling the marine routes that Japan relied on for commodities, particularly oil from Southeast Asia. Without control over these channels, Japan's war machine would come to a halt. As the United States marched through the Pacific, taking one island after another in a harsh campaign of island hopping, Japanese military officials realized that defending the Marianas would be a make-or-break moment. The Imperial Japanese Navy, despite being battered by years of attrition warfare, was still regarded as Japan's best hope for shifting the tide of the conflict. The plan, codenamed Operation A-Go, was straightforward. Draw the American fleet into a decisive battle near the Marianas, where Japanese air and naval forces could overwhelm them and provide a crushing blow. If effective, this approach would cover not only the Mariana Islands, but also the Philippines and Japan's entire defensive perimeter. The United States, on the other hand, was acutely aware of the Marianas' strategic importance and the impending naval conflict. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his planners had long recognized that the key to defeating Japan rested not just in battle itself, but also in steadily limiting Japan's ability to wage war. By shutting off essential supply lines and seizing key bases, the United States could isolate Japan and put it into a vulnerable position. The Marianas were key to this idea. Not only would their conquest provide bases for strategic bombing, but it would also act as staging grounds for a future invasion of the Philippines, and possibly even Japan itself. For all parties, the stakes couldn't have been higher. As the United States force approached the Marianas in June 1944, the stage was set for one of World War II's most significant naval confrontations. The Japanese fleet under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was confident in its ability to trap the Americans. However, as events would later reveal, Japan was fighting an unwinnable conflict, both militarily and strategically. The Japanese approach was built on the notion that their carrier-based aircraft could still strike a decisive blow. Japan's carrier fleet had been severely weakened in previous battles, most notably the Battle of Midway in 1942, but the Japanese had spent the majority of the previous 2 years rebuilding their forces. Operation Eigo was the culmination of their efforts. The plan planned for a series of coordinated attacks by Japan's remaining carriers to attack the American fleet from afar, while the Japanese surface fleet waited to fight any surviving American ships. However, Japan's strategic assumptions proved tragically incorrect. The United States Navy, led by Admiral Raymond Spruance and Vice Admiral Mark Mitzer, had grown much stronger during the war's early years. The American fleet now possessed the Fast Carrier Task Force, a formidable force of aircraft carriers, battleships, and cruisers backed up by advanced radar and superior aircraft. The F-6F Hellcat, America's primary fighter during the conflict, outperformed Japan's aged Zero aircraft. Furthermore, the American carriers were outfitted with a huge number of trained pilots, as opposed to the increasingly inexperienced Japanese aviators. The strategic landscape also suited the Americans. By June 1944, the U.S. had established naval and air superiority in the Central Pacific. American submarines had been methodically sinking Japanese commercial ships, significantly disrupting Japan's supply lines. Oil shortages and a lack of supplies limited Japan's ability to conduct war effectively, whereas the U.S. war machine was operating at full capacity. American shipyards were building new carriers, battleships, and aircraft at an unprecedented rate, and the United States was able to field forces that dwarfed Japan's shrinking navy. For the Japanese, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was a last-ditch attempt to reclaim the initiative. The fall of the Marianas would imply more than just a loss of land. It would mean the collapse of Japan's defensive perimeter, paving the way for an American invasion of the Philippines, and eventually Japan itself. The stakes were existential, and the Japanese High Command was determined to risk everything to avoid such a tragedy. As the two fleets approached each other, it became evident that the Americans were more prepared. American intelligence had successfully broken Japanese codes, providing commanders with a comprehensive picture of the enemy's activities and intentions. This intelligence edge enabled Admiral Spruance to place his forces to protect against Japanese bombers, while Admiral Mitzer's carriers launched devastating counterattacks. The American pilots, many of whom were combat veterans, outnumbered and outperformed their Japanese counterparts. The result was a one-sided event that became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese aircraft were shot down in droves, leaving their carriers helpless against the unrelenting American attacks. By the end of the conflict, Japan had lost the vast majority of its carrier-based aircraft, as well as 3 fleet carriers. The Japanese fleet was forced to retreat, with hopes of reclaiming the initiative dashed. The fight had far-reaching strategic ramifications. The destruction of Japan's carrier air arm rendered the Imperial Japanese Navy incapable of mounting any major offensive operations. The fall of the Marianas meant that the United States now had air bases within striking distance of Japan's home islands, allowing it to undertake long-range bombing operations that would destroy Japan's industrial capabilities. In the months following the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the United States began systematically bombing Japanese cities and enterprises. The liberation of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam gave the Americans the bases they needed to deploy B-29 Superfortress bombers on operations over Japan. These bombing tactics would culminate in the firebombing of Tokyo and later, the dropping of nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The conflict had broken Japan's ability to defend its empire while also bringing the war to its doorstep. For the Japanese military, the fall of the Philippine Sea was the beginning of the end. With its navy damaged and air power exhausted, Japan had few options. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the glory of the empire, would never again represent a significant danger to the United States Navy. From this point on, Japan was compelled to adopt a defensive posture, depending more on kamikaze strikes and other desperate tactics in a vain effort to avoid defeat. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was more than just a naval conflict. It was the tipping point in Japan's demise. It marked the end of Japan's strategic position in the Pacific and laid the groundwork for the final, deadly phase of the conflict. As U.S. forces drew closer to Japan's home islands, the conflict laid the framework for an invasion of the Philippines, retaking the Pacific Islands, and eventually occupying Japan itself. In retrospect, the Battle of the Philippine Sea might be viewed as the moment when the balance of power in the Pacific swung irreversibly in favor of the Allies. For Japan, it signaled the start of a long, slow slide that would culminate with the surrender aboard the USS Missouri in 1945. For the US, it was a victory that vindicated the island-hopping strategy and highlighted the overwhelming superiority of American naval aviation. Finally, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was more than just a triumph for the United States. It was the death knell for the Japanese Empire's hopes of dominance in the Pacific. With the loss of their carriers, planes, and expert pilots, the Japanese were powerless against the U.S. attack. The Pacific War's last act would emerge from the ashes of the fight, with the United States pushing inexorably toward victory and the end of the most destructive warfare in human history.